This video has been in the plans for about 3 months now, and that is because one of you, the MPP family, a subscriber and regular commenter, has asked around AdMech. And Aaron, this is one of those videos that I promised you long ago. We're tackling the AdMech in the form of the Horsemen from the Combat Patrol, and we're going to be painting them up in a scheme very similar to the Deimos sub-faction. We are going to start from a zenithal prime, but then use a black contrast to map out all of the areas on the model that we are going to be painting in near enough any form of metal. In this case, we are going to be painting items like the legs, the arms, the armor panels, and the trim. We have left the weapons for now, and we can come back to them a little bit later on. But once we have mapped out all of the areas, we can come round and start to base coat all of the armor panels and the trim. And to do this, we're going to need a warm dark bronze. We then want to shift focus to just the panels and leave the trims alone for now. And what we're going to do is take our base coat bronze, add in a little bit of a red metallic in a roughly 50-50 ratio, and then use this new mix, which we can then apply over all of the panels. We essentially want to cover all of the panels while avoiding the trim, and if necessary, just leaving a small amount of that base coat in those hard to reach recesses. Don't worry, we're going to be coming back and painting the trim in a little while, and we'll be focusing on the armor just to come in a minute. But what I wanted to quickly do is touch on the scheme itself. And we're going for the Deimos scheme, which is a really nice sub-faction, but I did have a couple of other options which I chose not to use in this case. First off, I have a unit of 4 armigers, and they've been painted up in the same scheme. They've got a really nice sandy brown tone with a really popping gold trim scheme. So I could paint this to be very similar to that, which would show that it's a Forge World supporting those knights. Alternatively, I've also got a Cybernetica army, which consists of a bunch of the big robots and the data smiths that go with them, and they've been painted up in a dark blue scheme with a black arm. That was designed to support my Deathwatch army. They were the AdMech reinforcements for that army, and the black sleeve was kind of similar to the Deathwatch memorabilia that they wear themselves. So I could paint this army to look like that. But as you can tell, we're doing neither of those things. We're actually going for Deimos, which is a nice sub-faction Forge World of the AdMech. And it fits in nicely kind of with what we've got already, mainly because the Deimos sub-faction is the one that was kind of acquisitioned and used for the Grey Knights. They're a secretive AdMech clan or Forge World, and they were actually transitioned and moved. Their entire home planet or moon has been moved to help conceal and protect the secrets of the Grey Knights. And given that the Grey Knights are kind of linked to the Deathwatch and the Agents of Imperium, which I've also got a combat patrol for, then it makes sense to make this AdMech clan or AdMech Forge World that sub-faction, because it ties in nicely with everything that we've got so far. So with that said, like they moved the moon from Mars to Titan, let's move back to painting these models. With our last round dry, we can move across and add a little bit more red into the previous mix until we have around 75% of the ratio being our red metallic. This will then be layered up on the last round to give us more of a generic red feeling and tone to the army. And what we're going to do is apply this as a relatively broad highlight, picking out all of the raised and bulky sections of the armor panels. This will hopefully give us a relatively smooth transition from a deep, rich brown in the shadows up to a brighter, shiny red hue, which we can finish off by taking the pure red metal from our mix and applying this in thin, semi-spot style highlights across all of the armor panels, giving us that bright pop of metal in our chosen red tone. We can leave the metals alone for now. We're going to be coming back and touching up the trim, but we've got the reds in a nice place so that we can judge the saturation and hue against the other areas that we're going to be painting. So what we're going to do now is come in and paint things like the fabrics and the robes. And on this scheme, that is painted in a relatively pale blue. But naturally, we don't want to go just straight in with the blue. We want to add a little bit of depth. So to do that, we're going to make a shadow color first and use that as our base coat by mixing in a dark neutral gray, which will give us a slightly darker, more desaturated version of our bright desaturated pale blue. This newly created mix can be applied over all the fabric areas. This is where the zenithal comes in quite handy. Because it's lighter, we're able to apply a couple of coats in order to get a smooth coverage, which would be harder to achieve if we were doing this over a black. we are going to be using this on all of the outside fabrics on the model. So in this case, that's the trousers, the jacket, as well as the suit the horse is wearing. Once we are happy with the base coat, we can go around and apply a quick broad highlight, and we're going to be doing this using the pure desaturated blue from the mix, and then pick out all of the broad flat surfaces, giving us a nice cool highlight. Now in hindsight, I probably should have gone a little bit darker here. I think that it came out nice, but there isn't actually that much color contrast and dark to light contrast in that area. We've only done one base and a highlight after all. So let me know down in the comments, do you think we should have done a slightly darker shadow and brought it up brighter, or should we go slightly brighter with the highlights to add in that contrast? You can let me know down in the comments, which is just below that subscribe button that you've probably hit, right? Yeah? Shameless subscription request sorted. Let's move on and tackle the inside robes. And this we're going to be painting in a pale white tone. However, we want to learn from ourselves, so what we're going to do is start to add a darker base, and then apply this as the first coat of our mild blue-grey. We then need to mix in a very pale grey, and then start to pull the paint across the brightest sections, going from the shadowed areas to the highlight sections. This light grey in the mix is very pale, and that means we can now use it pure and thinned for the next coat. Once again, building up on the last layers, pulling to the brightest sections from the shadows, making those highlights read closer to white. We won't actually be using white in this scheme, however. We're instead going to mix in a small amount of ivory, which is very close to white, but slightly warmer. This will help to give us that final pop of brightness, while adding a slight warmness similar to the effect of sunlight hitting a white surface. But mainly it will also add a little bit of colour nuance in that area. Now we need to come back and do all of the metals, but before we do, there are some elements that we haven't yet base coated. Things like the guns, they're still in our zenithal, and we want to add a little bit of nuance and variation across our metals. So the easiest thing to do is to grab a brown contrast and use this for the other metal areas we haven't already painted black, and then we can start to build up the actual metal layers on top, and we'll get a little bit of variation across our model. Our brown contrast should go over all of the areas really nicely in one smooth coat, and we're targeting things like the weapons, but also picking out minor elements like the saddle as well as the pouches. Then what we can do is jump across to the actual metal paints, where what we're going to do is use 3 options across the model. The first one being a dark silver, and this one can be carefully painted over set areas. Here we are opting to pick out all of the pipes, tubes, and any of the elements that look like they may be piston bars. These will then get a nice dark silver, as I said, before we move across to a bluish metal tone, and we're going to be using this as a heavy overbrush, focusing on set elements, in this case mainly the horse's legs, but we're also going to be picking out the other horse structure elements, like the spine and the ribs and the tail. We can also use this to pick out all of the guns, which will tie the riders into the horse nicely. What this will do is spread all of the metal tones out across the rider and the models quite nicely and give us a little bit of variation. So without a lot of work, there's different tones and different feelings and different effects and reflections. However, that is what we're doing with the blue. We're essentially doing a relatively scratchy, broad overbrush. If we have some of the black in the recesses, it's not a problem. We want the majority of it to be in the blue. But as I said, it is a relatively broad, scratchy overbrush that we'll be doing. Whereas for the third one, which we're going to be touching on now, this is where we're going back to the trim, and we're going to need a slightly brighter, rosier gold, and we're going to have to jump in and carefully apply this around the model. Taking a warm mid-brightness gold, we are going to use this in a couple of different easy ways. The first is to carefully work around all of the armor plates and meticulously pick out all of the trim. This should go over the bronze base coat that we did a long time ago and give us that nice pop of golden shine next to all of those red panels. We will also be able to use this on a couple of other elements, so we're targeting things like the canister on the chest of the horse, as well as the various elements on the knee joints. Finally, we can take this gold and apply it to the details on the guns. So we're picking out all of the things that are ammo and rotary dial sections so that we get a nice shine on those areas, as well as coming in and doing a broad overbrush of this color on the arms of our riders. We are going to spend a little bit more time brightening it up, and I am going to quickly touch on the trim. I do like touching up and finishing the trim kind of near the end of the process after we've painted the components around it. And the reason for that is, yes, it can be kind of pernickety to go in and carefully work around and highlight all of the trim very, very carefully. However, I would rather use that amount of attention and focusing on one time on the stages that I need to, rather than do all of that work, get it up to the right highlight color, and then accidentally cover it in a blue and then need to come around and redo it all. The blue is a lot easier to touch up in my mind than the trim, so I like to come and do the trim later where possible. Obviously, they were all using the same base coat as our metal plates, so it didn't matter at that point, but that's why we did the red from that point onwards and didn't touch on any of the trim. Then it is just a case of repeating the last steps. We are hitting the same elements, so we're going round and hitting the trim, hitting the guns and the chest barrel. But this time round, we want to focus more on the areas we're hitting. So for the trim, we're mainly going round and picking out the top sections as well as the belly of any curves. This will give us a nice move to a bright pop of gold worked up from a relatively muted darker bronze. The same thing then applies to things like the barrels and the arms of the riders. So what we're going to do is take a bright silver once we've overbrushed the initial brighter gold, and then reapply this overbrush using this lighter silver, bringing up the top level of the metal, giving us a nice worn looking chipped surface with rusty golden browny looking recesses. And then what we're going to do is finish this off with a couple of washes. The first one being in the form of a red wash, which we're going to use in two ways. First, we want to apply a thin coat of the red wash across all of the armor panels, being careful to avoid the trim. This wash will pull into the areas that we have tended to apply less of the red metallic. And what this will do is give us a nice blended transition and add some more red tone in those areas. The other way we're going to be using the red wash is on all of the other metal areas that are not the trim. So essentially anything we've applied the blue metal to, so the horse's legs, the ribs, the spine. The red will impact the blue in such a way that it gives a really nice worn metal with some red rosy shadows. While areas like the arms of our riders, we want to separate them differently, applying a black wash just in order to pick out all of the recesses and the details, giving us a nice spread of metal tones across our model. And to be honest, that kind of finishes off the riders. I managed to paint these up over a course of around 3 days, painting a few hours a night. So I think it's quite nice and achievable, but there are some key elements that we touched on in this video, kind of around prioritization, order of application. As I said, really like doing the trim last. I think it's a lot easier to go around and do all of the trim after I've painted the armor sections and the fabrics around it. Even though I may have to touch up the fabric if I miss the trim, my hope is that by doing the trim last, I can reduce the amount of times I need to reapply things. So it makes it a lot quicker. However, let me know what you think. As you can see, there are still elements on here that we need to finish off. Obviously, you'll notice on these models, there are some differences between the normal ones. First off, I did a couple of gun conversions, swapping out the barrels for some guns as well as just changing hands. And you may notice that I kind of hacked up a little bit some of the hind quarters of the horses. I didn't like the pouches on the hind armor and tried to fix that out, and then basically went to sleep when they were half done, forgot about it, built the models, primed it the next day, and then realized what I'd done. So because this is for a video, I had to kind of just make the best of it. And now it's just damaged hindquarters and one with a nice set of replacements. But I did swap some pieces out from other sorts of kits. Now, if you liked the metallic paint jobs and you enjoyed what we've done here, this faction goes really, really well with the Grey Knights because naturally they are designed to assist and help the Grey Knights. So if you want to see us paint some Grey Knights, why not check out us painting the entire Grey Knight Combat Patrol using a very shiny metallic scheme. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.